On June 1st, 2001, Microsoft's CEO called Linux a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. Today, more than 60% of Microsoft's own cloud runs on it. That quote wasn't a slip. It wasn't a bad day. It was the official position of the most powerful software company on Earth, a company that had spent years quietly funding campaigns to destroy the very thing it now depends on to survive. Because buried inside Microsoft's transformation story is something far more disturbing than a CEO changing his mind. It's the story of how you can call something cancer, try to kill it, fail completely, and then build your entire empire on top of its corpse. Let's go back to 1998. On October 31st, 1998, Halloween, someone inside Microsoft made a catastrophic mistake. They wrote the truth. A series of internal memos landed on the internet that day and exposed exactly what Microsoft's leadership actually believed about Linux. Not what they said in press releases, what they said to each other. The documents became known permanently as the Halloween documents, named for the date they leaked. The memos described Linux as a best-of-breed Unix on Intel hardware. They admitted that open-source development could harness the collective IQ of thousands of individuals across the internet, producing software that could meet or exceed the quality of commercial products. That last part is critical. Microsoft was publicly telling the world that Linux was a hobbyist toy. Internally, they were telling each other it was an existential threat. The proposed strategy inside those documents was not to build better software. It was to embrace, extend, and extinguish, a phrase that would follow Microsoft for the next 2 decades. Embrace open standards just enough to control them, extend them with proprietary features, then extinguish the competition by making interoperability impossible. The plan was elegant. It was also a confession, because you don't write a 12-page internal memo about how to destroy something that isn't dangerous. Linux had an estimated 7 to 10 million users in 1998. Windows had hundreds of millions. And yet the most powerful software company in history was drafting war plans. That tells you everything about what they saw coming. The war Microsoft was preparing to fight was already the wrong war. 3 years after the Halloween documents leaked, Microsoft's CEO Steve Ballmer decided that subtlety was overrated. On June 1st, 2001, in an interview with the Chicago Sun-Times, Ballmer said it plainly. Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. The quote spread instantly. It became the defining statement of Microsoft's relationship with open source. Aggressive, contemptuous, and absolute. What Ballmer said publicly was almost polite compared to what Microsoft was doing privately. In May 2003, Microsoft paid a company called SCO Group approximately $6 million for a license to Unix and Unix-related patents. On the surface, a routine business transaction. In reality, SCO was in the middle of suing IBM, claiming that Linux contained stolen Unix code. A lawsuit that, if successful, would have made Linux legally radioactive for every corporation on Earth. Microsoft's $6 million didn't just buy a license. It bought SCO Oxygen, then it escalated. In October 2003, Baystar Capital and the Royal Bank of Canada injected $50 million into SCO. Later reporting revealed that Baystar had been referred to SCO directly by Microsoft. A leaked internal SCO email from March 2004 claimed Microsoft had helped raise up to $106 million for SCO through various channels. Microsoft denied guaranteeing the investment. SCO called the memo a misunderstanding. The lawsuit collapsed anyway. A federal court eventually ruled that SCO didn't even own the Unix copyrights it was suing over. The entire campaign, years of legal threats, corporate fear, and tens of millions of dollars produced nothing. Linux survived. SCO did not. And this is the part Microsoft has never explained publicly. While they were funding a legal war to make Linux undeployable, Linux was quietly becoming the operating system of the internet. Apache, MySQL, PHP. The entire stack that powered the web ran on Linux, not Windows. Microsoft had declared war on the future, and the future didn't notice. That was only the first move. On February 4th, 2014, Satya Nadella became the third CEO in Microsoft's history. He inherited a company that was, by almost every measure, losing. Windows Phone had 2.5% global market share and was falling. The tablet market had been ceded almost entirely to Apple and Android. Azure existed but was a distant third in cloud behind Amazon Web Services, and the developer community had spent a decade treating Microsoft as the enemy. The people who build the tools, the platforms, the ecosystems, all of them, gone. Nadella's diagnosis was brutal and simple. Microsoft had confused its product with its purpose. The product was Windows. The purpose was to empower people to build things, and for years those two things had been the same, but the world had changed. Developers weren't building on Windows anymore. They were building on Linux, on open source tools, on platforms that Microsoft had spent a decade trying to destroy. So Nadella did something that would have been unthinkable under Ballmer. In 2014, standing on stage at a Microsoft event, he displayed a slide that read, "Microsoft loves Linux." The audience laughed, not because it was funny, because it was absurd. This was the company that had called Linux cancer 13 years earlier. This was the company that had funded SCO. This was the company that had written the Halloween documents. And now they loved Linux. Nadella wasn't performing. He was executing a strategy, because he understood something Ballmer never did. Azure needed Linux more than Linux needed Azure. If Microsoft's cloud platform couldn't run Linux workloads, enterprise customers would go to Amazon. Full stop. The choice wasn't between Linux and Windows. The choice was between relevance and irrelevance. In 2016, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation. They open-sourced PowerShell. They released SQL Server for Linux. They launched the Windows subsystem for Linux, letting developers run a full Linux environment directly inside Windows without a virtual machine. The company that called Linux cancer was now shipping Linux inside Windows. The next chapter is where it gets genuinely strange. On June 4th, 2018, Microsoft announced it was acquiring GitHub for $7.5 billion in Microsoft stock. GitHub was not just a code repository, it was the social network of software development. More than 28 million developers stored their code there at the time of acquisition. The vast majority of that code was open source. The vast majority of that open source ran on Linux. When the acquisition was announced, the reaction from the developer community was immediate and visceral. Developers began migrating to GitLab. Threads flooded Reddit. The fear was simple. Microsoft had a documented history of embracing open source communities and then slowly suffocating them. Embrace, extend, extinguish. The phrase from the Halloween documents trended on Twitter. Something unexpected happened. Microsoft didn't extinguish GitHub. They left it largely alone. They kept its leadership. They kept its culture. They kept it free for open source projects. The migration reversed. By 2025, GitHub had surpassed 180 million registered developers, more than 6 times what it had at acquisition. What Microsoft bought for $7.5 billion wasn't just a platform, it was legitimacy. It was proof in the most expensive way possible that the company had genuinely changed its relationship with open source. Now the number that puts all of this in context. In Microsoft's fiscal year 2024, Azure generated $75 billion in annual revenue, up 34% year over year. It is now the second largest cloud platform on Earth. And according to Microsoft's own published figures, more than 60% of customer cores running on Azure run Linux workloads. The platform that generates $75 billion a year, the financial engine of the entire Microsoft corporation, runs majority on the operating system that Microsoft's CEO called Cancer. The Cancer won. Microsoft didn't just adopt Linux, they built their entire empire on it. In 2020, Microsoft quietly released a Linux distribution, not a partnership, not a license, their own Linux, built internally, deployed across their own infrastructure. They called it CBL Mariner, Common Base Linux Mariner. By 2023, they rebranded it Azure Linux. And by 2024, they were positioning it as a full commercial distribution, the first general-purpose Linux server distribution Microsoft had ever released. Azure Linux now underpins Azure Kubernetes Service, the container infrastructure that thousands of enterprise companies use to run their applications. It runs inside WSL2. It powers edge computing deployments across Azure Stack HCI. The company that spent millions trying to make Linux legally undeployable now maintains its own Linux kernel fork and ships Linux as a core component of its commercial cloud offering. They are not embarrassed about this. They publish it. They market it. The Azure Linux repository on GitHub is public. By 2024, Microsoft ranked number 1 among all commercial organizations for open source contributions on GitHub, according to the Open Source Contributor Index, ahead of Google, Red Hat, and IBM. The same company, the same code base they tried to kill. And here's the irony that nobody in Microsoft's PR department will say out loud, the GPL license that Ballmer specifically attacked in 2001 is the reason Linux became unstoppable. The GPL, the GNU General Public License, requires that anyone who modifies and distributes Linux must release those modifications back to the community. Ballmer called this cancer because it meant proprietary companies couldn't take Linux, improve it, and keep those improvements secret. But that same requirement is exactly why Linux got better faster than any proprietary operating system ever could. Every improvement made by every company, IBM, Google, Red Hat, now Microsoft, flows back into the kernel. The cancer was actually a compounding interest machine for software quality. Microsoft spent years trying to kill the mechanism that made Linux great. Then they built a $75 billion business on top of it. On June 1st, 2001, Steve Ballmer called Linux a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. He was right about one thing. Linux did attach itself to everything it touched. It attached itself to the internet, to mobile, to the cloud, to AI infrastructure, to Microsoft's own servers. The question was never whether Linux was dangerous. It was dangerous. The question was, dangerous to whom? Turns out, only to the people who tried to stop it.